It has been more than 2 years since Justice Neil Gorsuch joined the nation's highest court. And now he is out with a brand new book, A Republic If You Can Keep It. Joining us now for a rare live interview, Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. Good morning to you.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. I love that you say that. What an honor to talk to you. Let me start with the separation of powers. When there is a conflict between the executive branch and the legislative branch, what is the role of the judicial branch?
Well, one thing I wanted to talk about in the book, and I've been writing about it and talking about it for years, is the importance of the separation of powers and how it keeps us free. And when it comes to the role of the judiciary, I believe the role is to be faithful to the original meaning of the Constitution. I tell my law clerks I have just 2 rules. Rule number 1, don't make things up. And rule number 2, when you're in doubt, when everybody is yelling at you, begging you to do this or threatening you if you do that, refer back to rule number 1.
I like that. You always hear conservatives want originalists, they want constitutionalists on the Supreme Court. Can you explain what it means to be an originalist or a constitutionalist, and how do you describe your judicial philosophy?
Well, I think originalism is badly understood, and it's kind of a misleading name. Our folks who disagree with it sometimes call themselves living constitutionalists. Well, who wants a dead constitution? I don't. I want an enduring constitution. And the idea of originalism is just simply that judges should follow the original meaning of the words on the page and neither add things that aren't there nor take away things that are there. And I worry that both of those things happen when we depart from the original meaning of the Constitution. I'll give you a couple examples. The first time the Supreme Court of the United States really departed from the original meaning of the Constitution was perhaps in Dred Scott, when the court found a right for white persons to own black persons as slaves in the territories of the United States. Scour the document as long as you want. You will not find that right there. They made it up. Or take the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees you a right to confront your accusers in any case against you. For years, the Supreme Court of the United States said, no, we're not going to enforce that right, except for when we think it's really important. And originalism says no to both of those things. It says we're not going to add things and we're not going to take things away. That the judge's job is to be faithful to the Constitution at all times. Nothing more, nothing less.
What would James Madison, who wrote the Constitution, what would he say about the government today?
Well, I think one thing he might tell us is to pay attention to the separation of powers. Madison originally thought we didn't need a Bill of Rights. He wrote the Bill of Rights, but he thought that what would really keep us free is the separation of powers. And if you look around the world today, I think he has a point. Every country in the world has a great Bill of Rights these days. My personal favorite is North Korea's. Yes, North Korea. It promises everything we have, a right to free speech, a right to privacy, and my personal favorite, especially this time of year, the right to relaxation. But the fact of the matter is that those rights aren't worth the ink on the page, and they're not because all power is accumulated in one man's hands. And what Madison knew is that people are not angels, and that we need to separate powers to keep us free. And I worry today when I read that only about 1/3 of Americans can name the 3 branches of government. And 10% of Americans apparently believe that Judith Sheindlin serves on the United States Supreme Court. Now, you know her as Judge Judy. And I love Judge Judy, but she is not one of my colleagues. And the truth is that our rights, including the separation of powers, are only as good as the people who want to keep them there. Daniel Webster said that it took 6,000 years for a self-governing people to arrange our Constitution, and it really was a miracle. And those things aren't kept by accident, and there's no guarantee they will endure unless people care about them.
I know your faith is extremely important to you, and the Declaration says we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what did our framers, what did our founders mean by God-given rights?
Well, they wrote down the rights that they thought were terribly important in the Bill of Rights, and they left it to us, we the people, to decide when to add to them, when to take them away. They didn't leave it to 9 older, I can say that now, judges in Washington to rule a country crossing a continent composed of 330 million Americans. And to those who say that we can't rule ourselves, that we the people can't do this, I try to remind young people about the story of Greg Wasson, who was a college student at the University of Texas in 1992. He's responsible for the most recent amendment to the Constitution, the 27th Amendment. We the people, we can do this. We can govern ourselves. It's a great story.
I know that there were some justices that you really look up to. One was Byron White. I want to get to a story about him coming up in just a moment. But I also want to quote something that you wrote in your book, A Republic, if you can keep it. Justice Scalia said this: if you're going to be good and a faithful judge, you have to resign yourself to the fact that you're not always going to like the conclusions you reach. If you like all of them all the time, you're probably doing something wrong, excuse me. Have you found wrong? You're doing something wrong. Have you found that to be true in your 2 years?
Well, of course, and I've been a judge for a long time, and the fact of the matter is any good judge will look back and say, I may not agree with this policy, or I may not have voted for that law, but the people's representatives chose to make that law, and my duty as a judge, when I put on that robe, is to put aside my personal preferences and to faithfully discharge my duty, which is to uphold those laws, to apply them neutrally. You know, they say that the robe is supposed to change a person when they take the bench, and I believe it does. We have 1,000 wonderful men and women in the federal judiciary who every day take that oath seriously.
And we're glad that you do. I know you clerked for Byron White. He was the first justice from Colorado, where you're from, right, appointed by Kennedy. And you tell a great story about, I watched an interview with you, and I want you to share it with the viewers. When you're walking down the hallway and you saw the portraits of other justices, what was that conversation?
So Byron White was maybe the most famous Coloradan of the 20th century, maybe ever. He'd been a Rhodes Scholar. He led the NFL in rushing. He was the highest paid football player of his day. First in his class from Yale Law School. He clerked for the Supreme Court of the United States. He was Jack Kennedy's best friend, and he served on the Supreme Court for 31 years. He was my hero as a young man. And I got the opportunity to clerk with him, which was a dream come true. And one day we're walking down the main hall of the Supreme Court of the United States, where the portraits of past justices hang on the walls. And he leaned over to me and said, "Gorsuch, how many of these cats can you really name?" And I had a moment where I had to decide whether I was going to be honest or try to impress the old man.
Yeah.
And I was honest, and I told him about half, boss. And he leaned over to me and he said, "Me too." And then he said something that really surprised me. That surprised me enough. But he next said, "And that's the way it should be. We're all forgotten soon enough."
Pretty powerful.
Those words stuck with me because I thought nobody will ever forget Byron White. But the truth of the matter is, we're now many years after he's passed, and he was right. And I came to realize he wasn't telling me something sad or melancholy. He was telling me something great and important, that we're all part of something a lot deeper, more meaningful than ourselves. This wonderful republic really is a miracle in human history. And there's no greater privilege than the opportunity to spend a lifetime in its service.
A great reminder to be humble. Sometimes he disappointed the people who thought that he would consistently vote left as an ideological liberal on the court. What did you learn from him?
Well, he disappointed people on both sides, I'm sure. And what was wonderful about Byron White was that he had the strength of character not to care, the courage of his convictions, and the incredible intelligence and hard work to follow a case through to the very bottom and reach an independent judgment on his own. And that's exactly the fortitude that Madison and the framers had in mind for judges when they established Article 3 of the Constitution. He was an example of a great judge.
There is an ideological divide amongst the justices on the court, but you wrote that we shake hands every time we gather, we sing to one another, we sing happy birthday with each other, we have lunch together, we don't talk shop, we have Christmas parties, and we sing Christmas songs at these parties. What has it been like over the last few years for you?
It's a wonderful group of people, and of course we don't always agree. You give us the 70 hardest cases in the United States of America to decide every year. Of course there are going to be disagreements, but they're not personal disagreements. And it's a wonderful collegial group of people. And yes, we eat lunch together, we shake hands, we sing poorly but enthusiastically, both at Christmas time and at birthdays. And we played practical jokes on one another, too. I think my favorite one is Sonia Sotomayor came in one day after the Yankees had a good run. And she was wearing a black robe with pinstripes on it, and the New York Yankees emblem on her chest. And I think all the other justices were wondering quietly, are you really going to wear that on the bench? But nobody said anything, and we're lining up to go into the courtroom. And finally, one of my colleagues said, Sonia, are you really going to wear that? And she said, no, I was just waiting for someone to ask.
That's great. Your wife is precious, your family. I'm curious to know, how has it been living in Washington? You're from Colorado, big fly fisherman.
I am, and I miss Colorado just about every day. I think I realized that life was going to change maybe the day I was nominated. The president asked us to come to Washington, but to do it quietly. He wanted a surprise announcement. And how do you get into the White House without anybody knowing? And it turns out it's through the kitchen door. And so Louise and I snuck in through the kitchen, and the president graciously allowed us to use the Lincoln bedroom as my office for the day. And I got to write my remarks for the evening next to the Gettysburg Address.
That's amazing.
A moving experience. Louise was given use of the Queen's bedroom across the hall. She's British, and that was quite something for her. That's where Churchill stayed during the Second World War. At any rate, Louise was allowed to call back to England. We weren't supposed to tell anybody, but she could call her father in England because it's England and who cares. And she woke up her dad in the middle of the night and said, Dad, you're never going to believe it, but Neil is about to be nominated to the Supreme Court of the United States. And she said, honey, I've been watching your American TV. I stayed up late. And I tell you, about an hour ago, they had another fella, a dear friend of mine, caught on TV driving to Washington from Pennsylvania. And I'm afraid it's going to be him. and Louise said, but Dad, I think it's going to be Neil. We're sitting in the Lincoln bedroom. And she said, and he said, honey, I understand that.
We can all relate to these stories.
Honey, I understand that, but the other fellow might just be down the hall. It's nice to know that while lots of things change, in-laws don't.
Thank you. That's right. Thank you. Pick up his book, A Republic If You Can Keep It. Famous words from Ben Franklin. Thank you. God bless you.